Humans are unisexual and viviparous. The major reproductive organs include the external genitalia, like the penis in males and the vulva in females, along with a number of internal organs including the gamete-producing gonads like the testicles in males and the ovaries in females. Let us learn about the organs of the male reproductive system. The male reproductive system is located in the pelvic region. It includes the testes, accessory ducts, accessory glands, and external genitalia. The testes are covered by a sac-like protuberance of skin and muscles called the scrotum. The scrotum lies between the penis and the anus. The testes need to be at a temperature of 2 to 2.5 degrees less than the body temperature to produce sperms. Hence, the scrotum is outside the body and has a temperature lower than the body. The testes are oval in shape, with a length of about 4 to 5 centimeters and a width of about 2 to 3 centimeters. The testes are surrounded by a tough connective tissue capsule called the tunica albuginea. Each testes has 250 compartments called testicular lobules. Each lobule, in turn, contains 1 to 3 highly coiled seminiferous tubules. The lining of each seminiferous tubule is called the germinal epithelium and contains the male germ cells known as the spermatogonia and Sertoli cells. The male germ cells undergo meiotic division to form mature sperm cells. This process is called spermatogenesis. The Sertoli cells provide nutrition to the germ cells. The regions outside the seminiferous tubules contain blood capillaries and nerve fibers, and small groups of large glandular cells are called interstitial cells or Leydig cells. Leydig cells synthesize and secrete testicular hormones called androgens. Reti testis, vasa efferentia, epididymis, and vas deferens are the male accessory ducts. The rete testis is a network of ductules formed by the seminiferous tubules. Vasa efferentia are ciliated ductules that arise from the rete testis. They collect sperms and transfer them to the epididymis. The epididymis is a long, narrow, highly coiled tubule present along the posterior surface of the testis. It is divided into 3 parts: anterior, caput epididymis; middle, corpus epididymis; and posterior, cauda epididymis. The epididymis stores the sperms temporarily and nourishes them. The epididymis leads to vas deferens that ascends into the abdomen and curves around the ureter and loops over the urinary bladder. It extends backwards and receives the duct from the seminal vesicle and finally opens into the urethra as an ejaculatory duct. The neck of the urinary bladder, ejaculatory duct, and prostate gland open into the urethra or urinogenital canal. The urethra extends through the penis to its external opening called the urethral meatus or urinogenital aperture. The urethra is the common passage for urine and semen. The male accessory glands include a pair of seminal vesicles, a prostate, and a pair of bulbourethral glands. They secrete seminal fluid that contains fructose and prostaglandins. The prostate gland is present at the base of the urinary bladder around the base of the seminal vesicle. It opens into the urethra through many ducts. The prostatic fluid contains calcium, citrate, and phosphate ions. The bulbourethral glands or Cowper's glands are pea-sized structures lying posterior to the prostate gland and at the base of the penis. Their secretions help in the lubrication of the penis. The external genitalia in males is called the penis. The penis is a copulatory organ and is covered by a loose sheath of skin. The skin that hangs over the tip of the penis is known as the prepuce or foreskin. It is made up of special tissues like corpora cavernosa and corpus spongiosum. The tip of the penis, covered by the prepuce, is called the glans penis. The penis, urethra, vas deferens, and Cowper's gland together help in copulation and in the deposition of sperm within the female. The female reproductive system includes the ovaries, oviducts, uterus, cervix, vagina, and the external genitalia located in the pelvic region. Along with a pair of mammary glands, it supports the process of ovulation, fertilization, pregnancy, childbirth, and child care. Let us study each organ in detail. The female reproductive system includes a pair of ovaries located one on each side of the lower abdomen. They are the primary sex organs as they produce the ovum or the female gamete. Each ovary is about 2 to 4 centimeters in length. They are connected to the pelvic wall and the uterus by ligaments called mesovarium. Each ovary is covered by an outer thin layer called the germinal epithelium. The germinal epithelium encloses the ovarian stroma, which is further divided into the outer cortex and the inner medulla. The cortex consists of many ovarian follicles in different stages of development. The ovarian follicle is the basic unit of the female reproductive system and is composed of roughly spherical aggregations of cells found in the ovary. The accessory ducts of the female reproductive system are the vagina, oviducts, and the uterus. The pair of oviducts or fallopian tubes is about 10 to 12 centimeters long and extends from the periphery of each ovary to the uterus. Each oviduct is differentiated into 3 parts, namely the infundibulum, ampulla, and isthmus. The infundibulum is a dilated funnel close to the ovary, and its edges are surrounded by finger-like projections called the fimbriae. They help collect and push the ovum into the oviduct after ovulation. The ampulla is the swollen and curved part behind the infundibulum. The fertilization of the ovum takes place in this part. The isthmus is a narrow and straight cavity, and it joins the uterus. The uterus is a hollow, pear-shaped muscular organ and is highly distensible. It is situated in the pelvic cavity between the urinary bladder and the rectum. It is also known as the womb. It is supported by ligaments attached to the pelvic wall, known as mesometrium. The uterus opens into the vagina through a narrow cervix. The cavity of the cervix is called the cervical canal, which, along with the vagina, forms the birth canal. The wall of the uterus is composed of 3 layers of tissues. The outer thin membranous layer is called the perimetrium. The middle thick layer of smooth muscle is called the myometrium, and it helps during delivery by producing strong contraction motions. The inner glandular layer is called the endometrium, and it undergoes cyclical changes during the menstrual cycle. The vagina is a muscular tube starting from the lower end of the uterus up to the outside. The opening of the vagina in young females is partially covered by a thin membrane called the hymen. The hymen is frequently ruptured in childhood due to strenuous physical exercise. The female external genitalia includes the mons pubis, labia majora, labia minora, and the clitoris. The labia majora consists of fleshy folds of tissue that extends down from the mons pubis and surrounds the vaginal opening. Hidden under the labia majora is the labia minora. Towards its upper end lies the clitoris, a small finger-like structure, and below it is the urethral opening. The female reproductive system is supported by the mammary glands. The mammary glands or breasts are modified sweat glands that lie over the pectoral muscles. They contain glandular tissues and a variable amount of fat. Internally, each breast is divided into 15 to 20 mammary lobes containing clusters of cells called the alveoli. The alveoli open into the mammary tubules. The tubules of each lobe join to form the mammary duct. Several ducts join to form a wider ampulla, which is connected to the lactiferous duct. The lactiferous duct opens out through the nipple from which milk is sucked out. There are 3 phases in the life of a living organism: juvenile, reproductive, and senescence. During the reproductive phase, organisms give birth to offspring. Interestingly, most organisms display certain morphological and physiological changes during the reproductive phase. Human females, for instance, experience the menstrual cycle, which is defined as cyclical changes in the genital system during the reproductive phase. Incidentally, a woman experiences her first menstrual cycle, called the menarche, at the onset of puberty, usually between the ages of 9 and 12. Occurring approximately every 28 days, a single menstrual cycle consists of 4 phases: menstrual phase, follicular or proliferative phase, ovulatory phase, and lastly, the luteal or secretory phase. Each phase of the menstrual cycle is marked by simultaneous changes in the uterus, ovary, and the secretion of hormones. For instance, during the menstrual phase, the endometrial lining of the uterus and its blood vessels break down and mix with blood, mucus, and other cell debris to form menses. The menses are discharged through the vagina as menstruation or menstrual flow, which, lasts for 3 to 5 days from the beginning of the menstrual cycle. Interestingly, the absence of menstruation indicates pregnancy or ovarian disorders such as polycystic ovarian disorder, or even factors such as stress and ill health. The menstrual phase is followed by the follicular phase, which occurs between days 6 and 14 of the menstrual cycle. During this phase, the primary follicle in the ovary matures into a Graafian follicle. Simultaneously, the endometrium undergoes proliferation, a process of regeneration which results in the formation of a new, thick endometrium. The follicular phase is followed by the ovulatory phase, which occurs during the middle of each menstrual cycle. During this phase, the Graafian follicle ruptures to release an ovum or egg cell into the pelvic cavity in a process called ovulation. The ovulatory phase is succeeded by the luteal or secretory phase, the last phase of the menstrual cycle, which occurs between days 16 and 28 of the menstrual cycle. This phase sees the transformation of the remaining Graafian follicle into a yellow mass called the corpus luteum. The endometrium too thickens, and its blood vessels become coiled and enlarged. Interestingly, the endometrium and corpus luteum play a vital role during the early stages of conception. For instance, a fertilized egg gets embedded in the endometrium and derives nourishment from it. The corpus luteum, on the other hand, starts secreting progesterone that helps maintain the endometrium and encourages the growth of the developing embryo. Conversely, in the absence of fertilization, the corpus luteum degenerates and triggers the breakdown of the endometrium. This marks the start of menstruation and the beginning of a new menstrual cycle. Did you know that the phases of the menstrual cycle are controlled by the interplay of different hormones secreted by the ovary and the pituitary gland? At the onset of menses, the anterior pituitary gland increases the secretion of the two gonadotropic hormones, luteinizing hormone or LH and follicle-stimulating hormone or FSH that simulate the development of primary follicles. However, the amount of estrogen and progesterone released by the ovary during this time is less, which causes the thinning of the endometrium. The release of LH and FSH keeps increasing, and during the follicular stage, these two hormones stimulate the maturation of the primary follicle into the Graafian follicle. Moreover, LH and FSH stimulate the maturing follicles to release estrogen, a hormone that helps in the proliferation of the endometrium. The increased levels of estrogen, in turn, cause the anterior pituitary gland to release a surge of LH and FSH, so much so that by the ovulation stage, the levels of FSH and LH in the blood are at their peak. This LH surge causes ovulation by rupturing the Graafian follicle and turning the follicle's remnants into the corpus luteum. The estrogen level in the body too reaches its peak, and we see a gradual thickening of the endometrium. However, once the corpus luteum begins secreting large amounts of progesterone, an FSH and LH inhibiting hormone, the levels of both these hormones drop, which in turn also lowers the levels of estrogen in the body. However, the endometrium continues to thicken because of an increase in the level of progesterone. Incidentally, the corpus luteum will keep secreting progesterone if a fertilized egg gets embedded in the endometrium. However, in the absence of a fertilized egg, the corpus luteum stops releasing progesterone and degenerates. A drop in the level of progesterone, in turn, triggers menstruation as well as the restart of the release of LH and FSH by the pituitary gland. Menstrual cycles normally stop once a woman reaches her 50s. This phase is called menopause. The menstrual cycle is an important process in a woman's body, and it consists of 4 phases which are controlled by hormones released by the ovary and the pituitary gland. Fertilization or fusion of gametes is the most vital event in the process of sexual reproduction, as it results in new life. In humans, while the male gamete or sperm is motile, the female gamete or ovum is non-motile. Therefore, for fertilization to occur, the two gametes must be brought together. This is achieved through insemination, where the penis releases semen filled with thousands of sperms into the vagina. Interestingly, while half of the total sperms released carry the X chromosome, the other half contain the Y chromosome. These sperms then rapidly move through the cervix, pass through the uterus, and finally reach the ampullary isthmic junction of the fallopian tube. In the meantime, the ovum, after completing the first meiotic division, gets released into the fallopian tube with the rupture of the Graafian follicle. Upon its release, the ovum begins to undergo the second meiotic division. However, the division does not go beyond the first phase. Interestingly, the ovum contains only the X chromosome. Studies have shown that the ovum is filled with cytoplasm called the yolk or vitellus, surrounded by a membrane called the vitelline membrane. The vitelline membrane is ensconced in another membrane called zona pellucida. However, there is some space between the zona pellucida and the vitelline membrane, which is called the perivitelline space. Surrounding the zona pellucida is a layer of granulosa cells called the cells of corona radiata. The ovum present in the fallopian tube now starts drifting towards the uterus. Once it reaches the ampullary isthmic junction, the ovum gets bombarded by several thousand sperms. However, only one sperm penetrates the zona pellucida and initiates the fertilization process. Moreover, this penetrating sperm induces the zona pellucida to stiffen, which prevents other sperms from entering the ovum. After gaining entry through the zona pellucida, the acrosome present over the sperm's nucleus starts secreting enzymes that aids the sperm head to get through the ovum's cytoplasm while the sperm sheds its tail. The fertilized egg now resumes the remaining phases of the second meiotic division. However, this division, being unequal, results in the formation of two unequal bodies, a haploid ovum called ootid and a second polar body. While the second polar body degenerates, the ootid and the haploid nucleus of the sperm fuse together to form a diploid zygote. Did you know that the sex of the zygote is decided at the time of fertilization? If the ovum is fertilized by a sperm containing the X chromosome, the resulting zygote contains XX chromosome, and would develop into a female. However, if a sperm containing the Y chromosome fertilizes the ovum, the resultant XY zygote develops into a male. Thus, it is the sperm that decides the sex of the fetus. A little more than a day after its formation, the zygote starts moving down the fallopian tube. Simultaneously, the zygote also undergoes mitotic division, and with each successive division, the number of daughter cells doubles. This division is termed as cleavage, while the resultant daughter cells are called blastomeres. About 3 days after fertilization, the zygote contains nearly 8 to 16 cells and is called a morula. Over a period of 2 days, the morula descends down into the uterus and transforms itself into a blastocyst, a hollow ball composed of about 100 blastomeres, which are arranged in 2 layers. The outer layer, called the trophoblast, eventually gives rise to the placenta, while the inner layer, consisting of a group of cells called the inner cell mass, eventually differentiates to form the embryo. Interestingly, at the blastocyst stage, the zygote, now called the embryo, gets attached to the uterus as the trophoblast grows outwards and penetrates the endometrial lining of the uterus. In response, the endometrial cells divide and start surrounding the blastocyst. This causes the blastocyst to sink and get implanted into the uterus. Once implantation has occurred, pregnancy gets initiated. Moreover, after implantation, inner cell mass cells get differentiated and begin to form the embryo. Embryo formation is thus a complex process that begins with fertilization and ends with implantation of the embryo. The joys of holding a newborn baby know no bounds. The birth of a baby is an intricate and complex process that begins when the zygote undergoes cleavage and develops into a blastocyst, a hollow ball consisting of a trophoblast, an inner cell mass, and a cavity called blastocele. As the trophoblast grows outwards and penetrates the endometrial lining of the uterus, the blastocyst, with a developing embryo, gets implanted in the uterus and pregnancy is initiated. After implantation, the trophoblast grows further, which causes the blastocyst to sink in and get covered by the cells of the uterus. As the blastocyst sinks further into the uterus, finger-like projections called chorionic villi start appearing on the trophoblast. As the chorionic villi grow further, they interlock with uterine tissues to form the placenta, a structural and functional unit between the developing embryo and maternal body. Interestingly, when the placenta begins to form, the inner cell mass moves downwards and differentiates to form an embryonic disc consisting of 3 germ layers: the outer ectoderm, middle mesoderm, and inner endoderm. The term germ layer indicates that each of the layers gives rise to tissues. The ectoderm, for instance, gives rise to the nervous system and the skin, whereas the mesoderm develops into muscles and organs such as the heart and kidneys, while the endoderm gives rise to the entire digestive system. Did you know that apart from the 3 germ layers, the embryonic disc also contains certain cells called stem cells, which have the ability to give rise to all the tissues and organs present in the human body. As the embryonic disc grows, the cells of one side of the disc grow faster than those on the other side. This causes the disc to roll and form a cylindrical embryo. Initially, this embryo is attached to the placenta, but as it starts to develop, it moves away from the placenta and remains connected to it via an umbilical cord. The placenta is an important structure that supplies the embryo with oxygen, nutrients, and hormones, as well as carries waste products from the embryo back to the mother. The embryo stays inside the uterus for 9 months, which is called the gestation period. During this period, the embryo undergoes several developments. By the end of the first month, the embryo develops a heart, while the end of the second month marks the transition of an embryo to a fetus with developing fetal limbs and digits. And by the end of the third month, most of the organs are already formed. Another 4 months and the fetus is rapidly gaining weight and its bones get stronger. By the beginning of the 9th month, the fetus is fully developed and assumes the position it will take during delivery. Interestingly, while the fetus is undergoing several developmental changes, the mother's body too is undergoing several hormonal changes. The ovary, for example, starts secreting a hormone called relaxin. Likewise, the placenta starts secreting hormones such as human chorionic gonadotropin, or HCG, and human placental lactogen, or HPL. Incidentally, HCG, HPL, and relaxin are secreted only when a woman is pregnant. Apart from the secretion of these hormones, the levels of other hormones such as estrogen, progestogen, cortisol, prolactin, and thyroxine also rise rapidly in a pregnant woman's body. These hormones support the growth of the fetus as well as maintain the pregnancy. Increased levels of progestogen and estrogen, for instance, put the menstrual cycle on hold and prevent the shedding of the uterine lining, which is embedded with the developing fetus. Hormonal changes also cause the cells of the mother's mammary glands to differentiate, resulting in these glands producing milk by a process called lactation towards the end of pregnancy. Did you know that at the end of the gestation period, the fetus as well as the placenta starts secreting hormones that set in motion mild uterine contractions called the fetal ejection reflex? These contractions in turn act on the mother's pituitary gland that now starts secreting oxytocin, a hormone that causes stronger uterine contractions. The simultaneous uterine contractions and oxytocin release makes the contractions stronger with every passing minute and ultimately results in the expulsion of the baby from the mother's uterus. This process of delivery of the fetus is called parturition. Immediately after the birth of the baby, the placenta is expelled from the uterus. Soon after birth, the baby needs to be breastfed by the mother as early as possible. This is because immediately after parturition, the mammary glands start secreting colostrum, a form of milk that is rich in antibodies and improves the immune system of the baby. Every baby thus begins its journey as a zygote, which develops into a fetus over 9 months. Reproduction, an important process in human beings, involves the fusion of the male and female gametes called sperm and ovum. These gametes are formed by a process called gametogenesis. In males, the process of gametogenesis occurs in the testes and is called spermatogenesis, whereas in females, gametogenesis is called oogenesis and occurs inside the ovary. Interestingly, spermatogenesis and oogenesis begin at different ages. Spermatogenesis begins at puberty, usually between 12 and 13 years of age, and is divided into 2 stages: spermatocytogenesis and spermiogenesis. Spermatocytogenesis, the first stage, occurs in the seminiferous tubules, whose inner walls are lined with spermatogonia, the diploid male germ cells containing 46 chromosomes. Some of these spermatogonia divide mitotically to form 2 daughter cells. Of these 2 daughter cells, one remains the spermatogonium, while the other one becomes the primary spermatocyte. This primary spermatocyte divides meiotically to form 2 equal cells called secondary spermatocytes. Unlike primary spermatocytes, secondary spermatocytes are haploid cells containing 23 chromosomes each. Spermatocytogenesis is succeeded by spermiogenesis, during which the spermatids differentiate into an elongated and tadpole-like spermatozoa or sperms. However, during this process, the heads of these sperms remain embedded in the Sertoli cells, which provide these developing sperms with nutrition. Post-spermiogenesis, non-motile sperms are released into the lumen of the seminiferous tubules by a process called spermiation. The lumen has testicular fluid that helps transport the non-motile sperm to the epididymis, where they mature and become motile. During ejaculation, sperm from the epididymis are transported via the vas deferens to the urethra in the penis. As the sperms pass through the different tubes, it mixes with fluids secreted by the seminal vesicles and prostate gland to form a mixture called semen, which is ejaculated by the penis. Did you know that semen released during a single ejaculation contains 200 to 300 million sperms? Microscopic studies have revealed that a typical sperm is covered by a plasma membrane and has 4 distinct parts: head, neck, a middle piece, and a tail. Inside the head lies an elongated haploid nucleus containing chromosomes. The anterior part of this nucleus is surrounded by acrosome, a cap-like structure filled with enzymes that help fertilize the ovum. The sperm's head is followed by its neck and middle piece, which is filled with mitochondria. These mitochondria break down glucose in the semen to produce ATP, an energy molecule that powers the movement of the sperm's tail. The formation of sperm is triggered when the hypothalamus secretes high levels of gonadotropin-releasing hormone, or GnRH. This GnRH acts on the anterior pituitary gland and stimulates the secretion of the luteinizing hormone, or LH, and follicle-stimulating hormone, or FSH. LH, in turn, stimulates the Leydig cells to synthesize and secrete androgen, a hormone that triggers spermatogenesis. FSH, on the other hand, acts on the Sertoli cells to stimulate the secretion of substances that nurture sperm cells during spermatogenesis. While spermatogenesis occurs at puberty, oogenesis is triggered before a woman's birth. When the germinal epithelium cells in the ovary of the fetus divide mitotically to form gamete mother cells called oogonia. A few oogonia divide again to form two immature cells called primary oocytes. The primary oocyte then gets enveloped by a layer of squamous granulosa cells, and together they make up the primordial follicle. The oocyte further develops as the fetus develops, but the granulosa cells do not change till puberty. In fact, primary oocytes enter the prophase of meiotic division and remain suspended till puberty. Did you know that at birth, a female has approximately 7 lakh oocytes? Incidentally, no oocytes are formed after birth. But by puberty, most of the primary oocytes degenerate, leaving only about 4 lakh in the ovary. At puberty, the release of LH and FSH hormones stimulate some primary oocytes to resume meiotic division that had begun during the woman's fetal stage. Moreover, due to FSH, the squamous cells of the primordial follicle enlarge and become cuboidal. The dividing primary oocyte and the cuboidal granulosa cells now make up the primary follicle. The primary follicle is transformed into a secondary follicle when it enlarges and is surrounded by several layers of granulosa cells, which in turn are enveloped by a developing theca or capsule. Later, these granulosa cells secrete estrogen, which creates the antrum, a fluid-filled cavity among the granulosa cells. Moreover, the theca becomes evident and gets organized into 2 layers, theca interna and externa. This structure is now called the tertiary follicle. As the secondary follicle transforms itself into a tertiary follicle, the primary oocyte within the follicle completes meiotic division, which is unequal and yields a large haploid secondary oocyte and a tiny first polar body. The polar body is believed to degenerate, leaving the tertiary follicle with only the secondary oocyte or ovum. As the tertiary follicle develops into a mature follicle or Graafian follicle, the antrum grows and the secondary oocyte and surrounding granulosa cells are pushed towards one end of the follicle. The granulosa cells secrete a glycoprotein substance that forms a membrane, the zona pellucida, around the secondary oocyte. The secondary oocyte or ovum is released from the Graafian follicle when it ruptures due to a surge in LH in the body. This process, called ovulation, causes the oocyte or ovum to be placed in the oviduct, where it awaits fertilization by sperm. In this way, the ovum and sperm are formed through a long and intricate process called gametogenesis.